I couldn't teach anything. We transform when we're present. We survive when we're present. And of course, today I have to talk about the incredible erosion of our presence. It's getting to a point of such a critical moment that until we dare to show up, we haven't got any chance really to survive on the planet. That is what I believe. Art has been created in order to awaken our presence. Every great play, every great piece of music, every great painting. I remember as a child seeing my first Rembrandt. And all I felt was this enormous rush of energy in me as the painting engaged me and I became present with it. And I suppose this journey I'm going to describe to you is a very personal journey, because later on I'm going to do a series on being present, and that will include being present with nature, being present in community, being present in leadership, and in the end, being present with Shakespeare. My personal journey is because I was brought up in a family when my father wasn't present, and that's a big issue. In fact, every conversation you had with him which mattered to you, and of course presence is a place of something mattering in you, was done with his Financial Times over his face. So this journey has been a long one for me and a very personal one. Let's go back to this idea of a two-way street. When a baby is born, it reaches out. And hopefully, it is met by a parent who's also reaching out to it. It is a returning of energy. It is a sharing of energy. And as that baby grows, it is introduced to more presence and group presence. And of course, this is so obvious that we can't argue with it. But over the last 50 years of teaching, I'm very aware of watching presence disappear from people. I'm sure it was disappearing long before I was born. But this erosion is so rapid now that it becomes a very poignant, critical thing. And actually, part of my career has been because people have come to find their presence. And in this podcast, I'll be looking at your body and your breath systems and introduce you to something that I've been working on for about 50 years called the 3 circles of energy, which is about a focus on how you become present. You know, teaching is very humbling because I suddenly realized years ago that I don't teach anything that you don't know. We know presence so well that I haven't invented it. What I have tried to do is to formulate exercises that will help you engage with your presence in the world, to show up with nature. Nature brings us into our presence. An actor was reminding me the other day that in 1992, I don't remember saying this, but he said that I said in a keynote that the erosion of our presence is continually linked to the erosion of nature. Not only does nature bring us to our presence, but as we lose nature, it is harder for us to be present. We cannot save nature by destroying nature, but we also have to save our human presence, and nature is one of the great givers of presence, the generosity of nature, and now we have to be a bit more generous to nature. My other thought, before we start talking about the work, is that maybe it is a political act to be present. I've met all sorts of people in my life, and as I said, people have come to me to learn presence, and that includes elite athletes, the military, judges, barristers, doctors. But I've also met people, particularly powerful leaders, who have quite openly admitted it is better to have a group of workers who are not present because they're easier to control. That sounds shocking, but I do remember in the 80s doing a job for a company, and the CEO said to me afterwards, I don't want them to be transformed or educated, just entertain them. And that was a shock. But also in the early noughties, I worked with a top CEO on Wall Street. I think he was in charge of 140,000 people. And the first thing he said to me, because we were travelling in a lift at lunchtime on Wall Street, and if you've ever been on Wall Street at lunchtime, everyone's queuing for lifts, and he had his own lift. And I said, why have you got your own lift? He said, I don't want to be present with anyone. And I thought, there we are. That's the problem. But eventually, I had to watch him do a keynote, a town hall to about 140,000 people. And HR said to me, he's dreadful. He's absolutely dreadful. And he was. And I was working with him, and I risked my job by saying to him, do you know, you might as well give them all an hour off because it's so boring. And he laughed at me and he said, exactly. If I bore them, they don't challenge me. So this idea of presence is huge, but it may be very important now to realize that it serves certain people. Maybe it is a political act to remain present. Let's go back to the beginning of my teaching, 50 years ago, and I had an epiphany. And actually, maybe you can't have epiphany until you're present. But I started to see that everything in a human body is connected. Now, that sounds so obvious. But nobody had taught me that. I was taught just voice. But I made the connection that voice starts in the body. Tension in the body stops the breath. If you can't breathe, you've got no power. And that connection was very critical, because I think it came after sitting in a staff room with staff who were mocking the students. I can't bear staff rooms where the teachers mock their students. It's just disgusting, really, but they were mocking, and I was the junior member of staff. And the conversations were going like this. Oh, he's got it. Oh, she hasn't. Roars of laughter. And I thought, what are they talking about, the it? What is the itness of it? And it occurred to me they were talking about human presence. And at that moment, I knew that what I had to teach was presence, not in a mystical way, but in a very practical, embodied way. And 50 years ago, what I saw in a classroom was the beginning of a physical deterioration of presence, and that connects to the breath. But let's be very clear. What I saw 50 years ago wasn't as bad as what I see now. What I started to see was that if somebody had a spine that was slumped, then they withdrew from the world with their presence. And then the knock-on effect went into their breath and their voice, so their voice disappeared. If they had shoulder tension, that created a push in the voice and a generalized presence. And because I'm slow of study, I just worked on these things very simply, very patiently, trying to find out how to help them. And I started to realize that presence, of course, is connected to something that matters. You've got to care about something and you have to give your full attention. So there was the beginning of being cool, which is about not being present. And as I started to work with people, I realized that if we didn't get certain things right, nothing was going to happen. So the first thing I realized was the connection to the floor was critical. Nobody ever, in my training, spoke about feet. Now, it just so happened at that time I'd been working in opera, and I witnessed Pavarotti not wanting to sing on a set because there was a carpet and he couldn't feel his voice. Equally, I met an amazing woman called Alexandra Samath, who turned out to be one of my greatest, dearest friends, and she had trained at RADA but had been a Hindu classical actor before. And at the RSC, very early in the days that I was connected to the RSC, she was the first actor I saw really take off her shoes to work, to feel the floor. So now let's start talking about connections in your body. You see, if I'm not standing on the floor, I start not being on my legs. Now this sounds mad. It's a dancer's term, to be on your legs. But the joke is that until I feel the floor correctly, I lock my knees. I didn't see anybody when I started teaching 50 years ago locking their knees. That's a new thing. That's relatively new. And as I started to trace these things through the body, I started to realize that if I wasn't standing on my feet and locking my knees, I couldn't get my breath down. If I couldn't get my breath down, my spine started to slump. If I couldn't get my breath down, I might pull my energy up into my chest. And a jigsaw puzzle started to appear, and I started to devise exercises to try and reconnect the human being to their full physical power and their full physical breath power. And gradually, I realized that these things were very simple to do if I could isolate where the tension started. And that's fundamentally what I do in life. I try and find out where the tension stops our presence, our breath, and eventually our voice. The erosion of this has been rapidly accelerating. Of course, we saw the profound effect after COVID, that young people could no longer even look at each other. But it was happening long before. Let's just be absolutely clear. This has been happening. And maybe, back to my CEO on Wall Street, it's easier to control us when we're not present. I remember a very famous director who's now passed. But he used to talk to his actors so much that they started to fall asleep. And eventually he looked at me and said, "It's great when I talk like that and they get bored because then they don't answer me back." So these are things that we have to understand about our presence and about our body and about ourselves, and that to show up with our presence requires attention and care, and something has to matter, but it's also incredibly difficult, because then you are revealed. And let me just say at this moment, there's no blame to anyone. You know, when I started to see in the early 80s young people's bodies collapsing, you know, we blamed the idea that all the playing fields had been taken away from children, so they didn't have anywhere to run, that they weren't able to walk on rough ground. Some of my students, I think I'm insane, but it's always occurred to me that when we walk in nature, we become present partly because we're designed to walk on rough ground. That urban pounding of hard, flat surfaces is actually entering our body and taking away our breath and our presence and eventually our voice. And this, again, my teaching career, I was teaching the Bedouin, and they talked about walking in the desert and walking on sand and hard rock and very jagged rocks. But the first time they walked into an urban setting, i.e. pavings, within 20 minutes of pounding, they could feel their knees, their pelvic area, their shoulders, their spine beginning to get so disturbed and painful that they were yelping in pain. So this idea of walking with our freedom on rough ground, and just as a political little point here, You know, we're hearing everyone talking about how important nature is. But we have to preserve nature. We can't just take nature away from people and think that they're going to stay present. Maybe that's not important to say at this moment because we'll do a whole podcast on it. So after a while of looking at bodies and seeing where tension was gathering, really, and the gathering of that tension stops the pure thing that we all have to do, which is to fully breathe in and gather and then give out our energy, which is all presence is. I started to try and formulate something that young people could understand. And over that period of time, and it took me, I think, probably about 10 years to formulate what I now call the 3 circles of energy. And the 3 circles of energy is a way of understanding how you lock off your presence. Second circle is our full aligned physical and breath presence. The place that we start in and the place we have to reset in. If I can teach you how to reset when somebody is taking your presence away, you have a chance. You have a chance to survive. You know, in my teaching career, I've worked, as I said, with the military. The Special Forces said to me once, if we have one person in our group that isn't present, we're all at risk. And for whatever reason, over the years, I've gathered a lot of great martial artists that come and work with me because of this simple idea that you have to be fully present in your body, centered, aligned, and aware in order to survive. We cannot survive without drawing on our presence. And how many of us have felt under threat, suddenly feeling our presence, realizing there is a danger outside us and that we have to connect to it. But equally in that presence, we have intimacy, we have connection with somebody. We have presence instead of absence. A woman said to me recently, do you know you can be alone in a room with somebody for 20 years? And if I talk about myself personally, the battle, because of my father, has always been to show up, how to show up. I often ponder that we often teach the thing we can't do very well, and that is being present. So this idea of 3 circles of energy, and the second is when we're fully aligned in our full economic, efficient power, and in that power, we allow our body to be at its highest level of engagement, and in that way engage with the world. And as the body becomes present, we can find the presence of our breath, the placement of our breath, which is what we're going to be working on later. Second circle. And for most people that I teach today, that is a distant memory. Oh, they say to me, oh yes, I've come back to myself. And sometimes it's as simple as looking at a photograph of yourself as a child and seeing that you were present, and then looking at the photograph when you stop being present in your body. And that connection, as I said, is a jigsaw puzzle. Second circle. A balanced body, a full breath, and a full giving out of your breath to the world. And when the word circle is used, there is a circle of energy around you. You don't have to look to be present. You sometimes feel presence. I don't know, most people have had the experience of knowing somebody's looking at them and turning around. Because if we're alert, we can feel those things. If we're tight and held, we can't feel those things. So second circle is going to be the study, the practice, the physicality that you're going to learn how to do. And by the way, because it's of us, everybody can do this work. It depends on how much you want to work on it and how dangerous it is. Because without any doubt, our presence and our withdrawal from presence is often to do with trauma, fear, or being ignored, retreating. But second circle will be the study of the rest of the podcasts around presence and nature, presence and leadership, presence and community, and presence and Shakespeare. But let's really think about the two other circles, the things that I started to look at 50 years ago with groups of students who wanted to show up but couldn't, and then the ones that showed up, the other staff were so pleased because they had it. And me having to say to young people, of course you're present, of course you've got it, of course you can show up and be connected to the world. And by the way, if actors aren't present on stage, there is no awakening of the artist. You can have craft and not care to do it. You can know how to make a table but not care to do it. So the presence has to exist and be married to our craft. Let's talk and maybe even begin to experience what first circle is like. When I talk about first circle, I often just pull my hands in. People will often talk to me and they'll put their hand on their sternum and pull themselves in. In a way, first circle is energy falling into us. By the way, all these things can be choice. All education is choice. You can do what you want, but you must have the choice. Sometimes in life we have to go into first circle. But it's not our natural presence. It's a habit. First circle pulling energy in. So the first things I started to notice with people in first circle was their spines being slumped. I was lucky enough, I've been very lucky in my life. I've just worked with amazing people who've been so generous to me. And of course, part of being present is generosity. To give out is a generous act. To be clear to an audience is a generous act. But I worked in the 70s with an amazing osteopath called Dr. Gerald James, who had been a surgeon but had gone into osteopathy. And he used to say, as soon as your spine goes, you age. Now, I thought that was quite funny. He was also moaning about platform shoes, saying, those shoes will destroy everything about your body. But that's another story. But I started to see that from behind, a young person, their body looked like an 8-year-old. They were so reduced through the spine. And of course, if my spine collapses, I can't breathe fully. The breath doesn't go deeply into the body. The head is then pulled forward, so you're looking down into the floor. Often, then, the feet come together rather than balanced under the hips. And then, slowly realizing that people in first circle were back on their heels, pulling away from the world. And of course, that's been a survival technique, to pull away from the world. First circle body, leading into first circle breath, leading into first circle voice, which is the voice pulling back. The problem with actors using microphones in theatres often is that they don't bother to even get their voice out. So again, it's just loud mumbling, that everything is falling in, looking down. And then it occurred to me that if I go to the theatre, long before you speak, we know whether we are going to listen to you. And we get messages from your body. If the curtain lifts up and there's an actor standing there in first circle, a very big exaggerated form of first circle would be your feet together, your shoulders rounded, looking down, maybe hands in front of you. That signals before you speak, servant. So first circle is a critical understanding of you reducing yourself and pulling away from the world. I'm going to make huge generalizations, so please forgive them. But it occurred to me that first circle is the worst of female habits of pulling away. No blame is attached to any of this. But in first circle, we might listen. Do you remember that two-way street in speaking, in negotiation, in consent, in discussion is an open second circle, present connection. So first circle people maybe listen, but we don't know what they think. We don't know what they are going to say. So again, it might be because of survival, but we don't know what you're thinking, and therefore, eventually, in certain circumstances, you will be ignored. So you're maybe taking energy, but not giving it. And at its worst is that you are forgotten. First circle. If first circle is reduction, and second circle is balance between our giving and receiving, third circle is an imbalance in pushing out your energy, So third circle people will often speak but never listen. First circle people might think about themselves but never give it out. Third circle will give it out without thinking about someone else. And by the way, empathy is found in second circle exchange. We're not going to change anyone that we disagree with until both of us decide to turn up in second circle and listen, and be prepared to change our mind. But that's for a whole other podcast. That's going to be explored in detail. So let's go back to third circle. I would suggest that third circle is what most world leaders are at the moment. I do know that most bullies I've met in the workplace are third circle. People who push away the world and just pronounce. There's no give or take. It's just speaking without listening. And you can see that in the body. Let's think about the body that pushes out. The chest is bluff. I used to call third circle, before I got the numbers, I used to have it in my mind that third circle was bluff, that it was a bluff position. I used to think in first circle that it was called denial. But of course that's too limiting. So third circle is a bluff. It is a disconnect with the world, but a pushing out on it. You see it in the chest. You see it often with very braced legs. You see it with very tight jaws. People forcing things. Not the balance of power, which is second circle, but force. And it goes with very gasping breath often, very conscious taking in of breath. And again, without blaming people, we've taken on third circle in order to cope with something. I'm not going to blame people, but the role of leaders at the moment is third circle, and at worst it's a bullying, narcissistic position that is about I'm more important than anyone else in the space. So third circle, that pushed out tension. First circle, a withdrawing. And in the middle is the sweet spot, in a way, of second circle, coming into yourself. And again, if you walk in nature or you're accepted in a community, you often feel the tensions drop away and you find yourself present again. As I said, it's the function of art, it's the function of community to bring people into their presence. So let's just touch base with the tensions in our body. as the baby is born, their body is centered, their breath is free. That's how we come on to the planet. And the tensions in the body desensitize us. I often have to work with somebody who a lot of people have huge problems with. Maybe in a company, they'll say, we can't bear working with so-and-so. And generally, they're third circle. And generally, and I believe this to be the truth, the vast majority of people are decent, but sometimes our tensions stop us understanding that our energy is disturbing. Doesn't make somebody a bad person. So I had a company come to me and they had a very successful, these people are often very successful, third circle, and he was perceived as a bully. And everything I was talking about in third circle, it was in his body, he was pushing, and what people, and particularly the women, found very difficult is that he came too close. He came too close to them. And they felt that he was intimidating them. He was coming into their energy, their circle of energy. Their circle of energy was being attacked by his presence. And I said to the women, all women that had problems with this, why don't you just step back? And of course, that horrified them. And I said, well, maybe we have to practice you stepping back, because he might then feel that he's too close. And we practiced me coming in too close and them stepping back. And that's what they did. And then he got it. And he came to me and he said, do they have a problem? And I said, yes, your energy. And he was profoundly upset because he'd been rewarded. Third circle people are often rewarded for this energy that is pushing out and desensitizes them. Equally, we are desensitized if we're in first circle. We become obsessed with ourselves, which is absolutely fine. But if we stop seeing out of ourselves, first circle, third circle, often we lose our curiosity because we become stuck in a tension. Curiosity, imagination, is about looking out at the world in second circle. Presence and second circle is the beginning of everything that we can do that is creative and caring and curious. It builds groups. The artist's job is to be present enough to awaken us.